Jane, you should probably make me co-host.
You are correct. I should do that.
And then if I have to share screen, we can do that.
Well, Shelley.
Hello, how are you guys?
Doing good.
Yep.
They're working on all the houses around me, so I'm gonna leave this on mute except for when I'm talking.
Shelley, is that because they're
Okay.
doing hail roofs or just regular maintenance?
No, it's because of the hail that we had so bad. It it damaged all the roofs and all the siding, all the gutters, several cars in our neighborhood.
We got a lot of hail this year, and I was hoping it would beat up on my siding so that the insurance could reside my house, but it didn't. So there.
Oh, it ruined everything. Top of our RV was crushed, my
Wow.
daughter's car.
That's too bad. Folks, as you're joining, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, please.
Hey, Kathy, this is Sarah Leach. Can you hear me okay?
Right at the end, Sarah, I could. Otherwise, you were really quiet.
Okay, let me
Oh, there you
try.
go.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay, you're good.
Because I know Natasha and I have a presentation and I'm not sure. We haven't really talked specifically about how we're going to run the slides and stuff,
Okay.
but I guess it's probably pretty easy, right?
Well, let's just, I opened it so that you could share screen. So whoever's gonna do that, you can grab that, yeah.
What could possibly go wrong, right?
Mine was doing so well, and then this morning during a 2-hour call, my entire Zoom went away. And then I got a message that, yeah, you can't get back into Zoom. It's not on your desktop anymore. Okay, great. Go ahead, folks, as you're joining, put your name and some kind of identifying stuff in the chat so we know who you are or who you'd like to be today. Jane, are you okay if we start about 1:02? Let people 2 minutes get in the door?
Yep, that's fine. I'm going to throw the agenda link in the chat and I'll do it again in a little bit after more people join.
Folks, as you join, feel free to put your name and info about you in the chat so we know who you are, and then we'll start right at 1:02. Okay, we might give it a couple more minutes because people are still trying to get in the door. We must need a wider door because they're all trying to get in at the same time now. Feel free to put your name, something in the chat so we know who you are. All right, we'll let Janice join us. Folks, go ahead and put your information, who you are in the chat. So we've got that for the attendance today. It's 1:05 and I think we'll start. We'll do our best to keep letting people in the door. Good afternoon. This is Kathy Zeman. I'll be facilitating today's LFAC meeting. Jane Jewett is the co-facilitator. She'll be taking copious notes. Thank you, Jane. I've got the agenda on the screen, folks, if you want to take a look at it. It's kind of big topics. Sarah and Natasha will start us off with their translation fact sheets, talk a little bit about cottage food, going into whether some of these boutiques and other businesses need licenses. Then we're going to talk about dogs at farmers markets again. And then we'll go to Kate and Alex and Val with the MDA updates on those grants. Casey I think, is not joining us on the organic, and then we'll wrap up and look ahead to that January meeting. Is there anything that needs to be added to today's meeting agenda? Feel free to unmute yourself and let me know, and we'll try to throw it in there if you need it to get done today. Okay, then seeing that none, I'm going to stop that and we can go to the big screen. So first up is Sarah and Natasha. You want to take it off?
Great. Hi, Kathy. Natasha here. Is the screen sharing working?
Yes, it is. And we can hear you. Thumbs up.
Perfect. Let me just get my notes here. All right.
Good, thanks.
Sarah, you okay?
Yeah, thanks for being willing to do the screen sharing. I'm going to keep my camera off because my Wi-Fi isn't that great. So I'm afraid if I put my camera on, you won't be able to hear me or something. And hearing me is definitely better than seeing me. So yeah, we are happy to be here today to talk about our translations project that MDA and MDH worked on together over the past couple of years. So just to introduce myself, my name is Sarah Leach, and I'm a planner principal with the Food Pools and Lodging Services section at Minnesota Department of Health.
All right. And my name is Natasha Hedin, and I work as an outreach coordinator within the Food and Feed Safety Division at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. So today we'll be covering the project background, purpose, project outcomes, milestones, challenges, details of working with a translation vendor and the roles, acknowledgements, and answer any questions that you may have. So to get everyone thinking about the importance of words and carrying context through the translation process, we wanted to share a quote from Mark Twain. So the difference between the right word and the almost right word is really a large matter. It's the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. So moving into the project background, in January 2019, a revision based on the 2013 FDA Food Code was adopted. Shortly after adoption, both of our agencies began working in earnest to develop translated documents to better serve the retail food safety needs of Minnesota's limited English proficient population. Both agencies secured grant funding through an AFDO award, the Association of Food and Drug Officials, and delivered a set of 55 English language documents to a translation vendor for translation into Hmong, Somali, and Spanish. The original project timeline called for completion by December 2020. However, COVID-19 activities prevented us from meeting that goal, and the project grant requirements were completed in June 2022. The main purpose of the project was twofold. One, to provide resources to the largest non-English speaking populations we serve through outreach and education, and two, to promote the state-local partnership by supporting the agency's goal to reduce the occurrence of foodborne illness risk factor violations in Minnesota. So next, let's talk about the project outcomes, their relevance, and measurement. The first outcome was to provide Minnesota Food Code publications covering the foodborne illness risk factors for non-English speaking food industry clientele. This is relevant as it supports the agency's goal of reducing the occurrence of foodborne illness risk factor violations in the state of Minnesota. It also supports the partnership between the agencies to better serve our non-English speaking clientele. This outcome was measured through the publications being made available on the agency's websites. The second outcome was that stakeholders would be notified and trained about the translated documents' existence. This was relevant as it supported the agency's goal of uniform retail food inspections and promoting long-term control of risk factors. This was measured through the dissemination of the documents using the following methods. At least one training session for state agency staff and delegated agency staff on the use and relevance of the fact sheets during inspections, and electronic notifications for stakeholders regarding the completed fact sheets and where to find them. So we can read this slide from left to right, row by row, to get an overview of the milestones for the project. One of our first steps in January 2020 was to prioritize the topics so that the documents touching most closely on foodborne illness risk factors would be translated first. We also recognize the importance of involving the Somali community in the early stages of the project. With a lot of help from Somali-speaking regulatory staff, we convened several focus groups with Somali food business owners and operators. These sessions were instrumental to the project in several ways. And one key takeaway was that we were able to determine the format for the final documents, that it should have translated text and English text side by side. In February 2020, we submitted the 55 source documents to the vendor, and in April, we received the first round of translations. At this point, we needed to make significant modifications to the project plan because both the project team and community partners had reduced availability due to COVID-19 and civil unrest. We did manage to get a community review of selected documents completed by July 2020 and throughout the later half of 2020. And into the first quarter of 2021, we worked closely with the vendor and stakeholders to improve the translations. By December 2021, we had received copies of all the translated documents. And by March 2022, we had received most of the back translations of the Somali and Spanish documents. And by May 2022, we received additional Hmong back translations, and at this point wrapped up our relationship with the vendor. As of June 2022, the Somali English and the Spanish English versions of all 55 documents have been posted online and are available for use. We are still working internally to finalize the Hmong English versions. So we faced some key challenges with this project due to the nature of the project itself and others due to outside events. We've all seen firsthand how the COVID-19 public health crisis has taken its toll on the already limited public health resources. Everyone in our project team, our community members, and even our vendor was pulled away from project work for urgent COVID responsibilities. Thankfully, AFDO and FDA generally granted us first a 1-year extension and then another 6-month extension to complete the project. The project size also presented a big challenge, both for our team here in Minnesota, as well as for the vendor. We included almost all of our food code print resources in the project, and we are providing translations in the 3 most commonly spoken non-English languages in Minnesota. Additionally, the technical nature of the document content is a third and impactful change. Even though our English source documents are written in plain language, I don't need to tell you that oftentimes we need to provide further explanation or training when working with operators. For Hmong and Somali, there is a further challenge in that certain terms may not have an appropriate translation. Finally, when publishing the documents, we needed to follow state agency policies for format, brand, and accessibility. And now I will pass it over to Sarah.
Thanks a lot for that summary, Natasha. Our project team, which included me and Natasha, as well as our supervisors, Kim Carlton is my supervisor at MDH, and Alita Sorensen is Natasha's supervisor over at the MDA. Our team interacted primarily with the vendor's project manager, and she in turn directed the work for each language team. The Hmong, Somali, and Spanish language teams each included an editor, plus 1 or more translators and back translators. Ideally, these teams remain consistent throughout the life of a project. However, for our project, there was considerable turnover, most notably in the Hmong language team, but also in the Somali team. While the contract and our best practices recommend that translators and back translators should, if possible, live in Minnesota, or at least in the United States, our vendor was unable to meet this benchmark consistently for this project. We believe that the project challenges of COVID-19, large project size, and technical document content, combined with a general lack of qualified translators, especially for Hmong, all contributed to the turnover. During our work with the vendor's Somali team and Somali-speaking staff from Minnesota regulatory agencies, we learned a lot about the role of the translator. So on the slide here, we've got some do's and do nots. So really the translator's job is to present the content from a source text in a different written language. And that translation should be accurate, it should be complete, and then the punctuation and construction should follow the rules of that target language. What a translator should not do is to further explain concepts or attempt to add clarity. You can go to the next slide, please. Similarly, a back translator is a person who works with the translated document and tries to represent it again in English. So a back translator should not be familiar with the source document at all. They should be literate in both the languages, both the target language, so in our cases, Hmong, Somali, or Spanish, and in English. And their role is to help the project team determine if the translations are complete and accurate. A back translation should not be, and you should not expect it to be identical to the source document or be a polished version of the content. So really looking at a back translation, you need to decide whether the key concepts are represented accurately, and you shouldn't be worried about whether it's a well-written document in the back translation. So next steps. We are done with this project, but this is kind of a timeline zoomed in on the final phases as we wrapped things up. So in June of this year, we created PDFs from the documents. We made sure that there was continuity between the different versions. And I think we'll show an example of this in a little bit, but we, for example, in some documents, we link to other documents, and in the translated versions, in the English column, we would link to the English version of another fact sheet, and then in the column that contained the translated text, we needed to provide the link to the translated version of that fact sheet. So we really had to kind of march forward with all the documents being promoted at the same time so that we knew what the URL would be and that it was a live link. As Natasha mentioned earlier, we did do some training and some notifications, which are summarized in that middle block. And we're continuing that now with presenting the information to people. And we were able in mid-August, we were able to close out the project on time with our report back to AFDO. So on this slide, we wanted to make sure to provide links to where you could find these documents. And we have two links on the left of the slide there. The first is for the Food Business Fact Sheets webpage, which is pictured in a screenshot on the right half of the screen. And the second link is a little bit like a higher up level in the website hierarchy. That's our Food Business Safety, which has a little broader than just the fact sheets. So there's a few documents, for example, the Food Establishment Construction Guide for MDH that you can find by that second link. It's a little difficult to see on the slide here, but thanks for showing us with the cursor there, where we've got highlighted in yellow. The first fact sheet alphabetically is the approved sources for food products fact sheet. So the first bulleted item there is the English version, and then you can see there's two indented bullets. The first one is the Somali version, and the second one is the Spanish version. The Hmong version of this document has not yet been finalized. We're still working on that, but it would be posted there as well. So Natasha, do you think you can open one of those? And we're going to go to that. We were going to open the illness reporting.
Just give me 1 second here. There we go.
So we just want to show you kind of how to get to that. So the illness reporting for food establishments, it's got the English version first, and then this one we have all three of the translations available. There's the Hmong there, then the Somali, and the Spanish. So I think just go ahead and open whichever one, and we can see how it looks. So here's the Hmong version. You can see the title of the document is, oh, we lost it.
Whoops, sorry.
That's
There
okay.
you go.
There we go. Okay, so the title of the document is the Hmong title. And then we have the English title is displayed there as well. And likewise, we have the Hmong subtitle and the English subtitle. So the left column of all the fact sheets is the translated or target language, and then things should line up very easily between the left column and the right column, so that if you need to refer to a specific section, for example, if I only speak English and I want to talk about employee responsibilities with someone who is more fluent in Hmong, I can easily find that, like Natasha is showing. And I know that the part that I'm looking at or pointing them to in the Hmong is the right part. So as I was mentioning earlier, we have some links. So there on the left side, we have a link, a hyperlink to the, oh no, rats, that one is broken.
No way.
Unfortunate, but good to know. We can fix that. That's all the same. So I think it's probably, I know the problem with this. So in any event, it will link to the Hmong one as soon as I fix this, which will be soon. And then on the English side, it'll link to the English version. So I think that is all we had there. We can go to here. Yeah, we did have a lot of people working on this project, and people from many different agencies. MDH and the MDA don't have quite as much diversity in our inspection staff, I think, as we find in some of our local health departments. As you can see there, Minneapolis and Hennepin County were big contributors to this project and did provide several inspectors with extensive food code knowledge as well as language capability. And then the very first group there, we had quite a few business owners, I think almost all from the city of Minneapolis, who were, Somali speakers and convened with us to discuss the fact sheets and how we could make this project productive for them. So hopefully we have included everyone on the list here. We had a lot of people that really made important contributions. So one more quote. All translation is a compromise, the effort to be literal and the effort to be idiomatic. And Natasha and I felt that this sentiment is really a great reminder that even now that the project is technically over, our work is not finished. Moving forward, we have the opportunity to continue to improve the food code resources we provide for Minnesota's limited English populations, both by refining the translations resulting from this project and by, excuse me, and by expanding the scope and type of resources we offer for our stakeholders. So I think we can open it up for questions if anyone has any. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to either of us anytime if you have questions.
It looks like Heather has a question. Heather, you want to unmute?
Sure, thank you. So I just, oh, sorry, my phone is, everything is beeping at me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So this is super exciting. I'm glad to see all this. I'm curious. I happen to come from the Department of Revenue. I was there for 13 years. So it's been about 1.5 years since I've been there, but in that time they used services with the language line. So I'm curious if there's any discussion at either MDA or MDH to take this another step further and offer language line services. So we would contract with, and it was, I don't remember how many languages we were able to work with, but a customer would call in, and if we wanted to explain something like a fact sheet or a tax return or something in more in depth, we would contract and kind of get the other language line person on the phone, and then we could pick a language. Is that something that MDA or MDH is looking into?
Yeah, we do. I know at MDH, we do have language line available. Maybe Wendy, I think, is on the meeting, or Angie, maybe you could comment more on how frequently that is used by our field staff. I really don't have an idea about how much it's used, but it is an option, yes.
So this is Wendy. We do have language line available. The instances that we need to use it primarily are with when we have situations where there's more confidentiality and we need to be working one-on-one with each individual employee, for instance, during an outbreak investigation or something of that nature. Generally, we're able to communicate with the management of the different facilities that we're in. Several of our staff are bilingual and are able to help us if there is some needs with specific establishments. But so the language line is something that we have used quite a bit.
And this is Natasha. At MDA, we also have the language line available to our inspectors in the field. And like Sarah, I also don't know those specifics, but I know we have some other staff on the call that may, if you know one want to jump on, feel free to jump in.
Hi, this is Nicole Beisel with MDA. I'll just say that we're very similar to how MDH functions, of using it more on a limited basis only if confidentiality is more of a concern. And we also have some bilingual staff to help us through the inspection work. So very similar to what you just heard from Wendy.
Great. I am actually going to call on Annalisa Haltberg. I know she's traveling. Annalisa, are you able to join?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I want to have you speak to what you've experienced with Hmong translation, and that it sometimes takes like a longer explanation to translate a word. And I thought of that when Sarah was saying that a translator should not try to provide extra clarity, and just wondering how that plays out when you've got a language like Hmong where there isn't a direct translation sometimes and you have to explain a word using other words. How does that shake out?
Yeah, I think that often there isn't a word in a language and they end up using a lot of descriptive words, but in a regulatory setting, in any I think I guess I would work with the translator or the interpreter ahead of time to be clear, to not add anything, to have to understand the regulation enough to not overstep it and but add descriptors as necessary, because sometimes there just isn't another word. And it ends up having to be longer, but in a regulatory setting, that is, they can't overstep that too. But I was also thinking that too, Jane, and actually being kind of amazed that those lined up so nicely, that the Hmong wasn't a lot longer than the English.
Yeah, I
Well-
noticed that too. They weren't offset by much. So,
I can jump in here. I'll pull back the curtain and reveal our secret in case you're wanting to create a document. What we did was we inserted the text in a table format. And so we did it, each section was in the table cell to the left or to the right. That's how we got things to line up. So it wouldn't have lined up nicely if we hadn't done it that way, but we waved some magic wands and got it done that way.
Thanks, Sarah. I think I have the right link in the chat that gets to that page with all of those. Sarah and well, all of you, how can we help you get these out to the stakeholders? I can imagine maybe our market managers, there's 350 some farmers markets out there. We will have licensed food vendors that may want to access these. Got any good plan for us helping you help us?
Well, this is Sarah. I think just providing the link to the webpage where we have the things posted, that's where all the most up-to-date documents will be linked. So I think that's probably the best way to get the most accurate information to people, is provide the link to the website so they can go there and download the current version. As you can see, sometimes we have errors and we need to update them. So I think providing the link to the site is better than providing direct links to the documents or just copies of the documents.
Good point. Okay. Any other questions for Sarah and Natasha? Otherwise, we'll call on Alida to talk about the cottage food translation project. Oh, Lori Cox has a question. Lori, go ahead.
Just super quick. And I don't know if this is a request coming across, but because there's a tribal liaison with MDA, was there any consideration, or has there been request to do anything with tribal languages?
This is Sarah again. From the MDH point of view, I cannot recall over the last 10 years or so receiving any requests for tribal language translations. We get them every once in a while for Hmong, Somali, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, but I can't recall one for a tribal language.
And this is Natasha at MDA. I would say the same. And especially for this project, like we focused on the 3 languages because those were the largest populations. So.
Thank you.
Okay. Seeing and hearing none others, we'll invite Alida.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Very good. Well, I don't have a fancy presentation, but I wanted to piggyback off of Sarah and Natasha's presentation because we are also doing some additional translation work within Minnesota Department of Ag on the cottage food materials. Some of you have already heard my spiel before, so this isn't an update since the Cottage Food Producer Association meeting last week, but I wanted to make sure it got to a broader audience. That we do have all the cottage food materials available in Spanish, and they are on the website. And then as illustrated in this last project, that there can be some challenges when it comes to other languages where maybe folks speak the language but don't necessarily read it, or we can't cover every single language that might be requested. So what materials could we create that are a little bit more maybe visual in nature? And so the next step of our project is to do some surveying of both the cottage food producer industry, but also stakeholder groups and partners, cultural associations, and folks who might have some insider input on what we should prioritize. And the big thing here is we don't have as many resources. We don't really have any resources to go towards this project like this, this AFTO translations project that was grant funded. We do need to be a little bit more efficient in what we do here. So we want to make sure that the juice is worth the squeeze. And so that's kind of the next step, is to get some more details on which languages we should be focusing on, what types of materials have been most helpful, and what folks might like to see, whether it's on our website or it's something we can provide in person through a training, or it's a recording we can make on YouTube, trying to be a little bit more creative and not kind of stuck in how we've always done things with translations. Obviously with fact sheets, those are good to translate directly and then, have those all available for everybody. But some of these cottage food documents and trainings, they might be more helpful in different formats. So trying to think a little bit outside the box, though that does complicate the project a bit. So we are working on that, looking to wrap this first part of the project up by the end of the year, where we'll have a direction we want to go in and start doing some translation work. So pretty quick update on that, but just wanted to make sure the group was aware that that is going on in the background. And the Spanish direct translation is already available on the website.
Any questions for Alita? For both Alita and then Sarah and Natasha, do you folks have a plan for how often you're going to regularly review and revise? And the only reason I bring that up is that as we look at some of the other material that we've got out there, we realized that there's some big errors, right? Either because the law changed or interpretation has changed. And so we're looking at trying to schedule it like every 18 months or every 12 months or every 2 years, that we go back and touch it and make sure that it's still legal and correct and accurate. I know I feel like this is a bad question to ask since you're just now finishing up this great big project, but what do you think about your review process there?
This is Sarah. I can speak to that. I know we did discover one spot, I think, during this project where we needed to go back and make a change in the English version and then make the corresponding change in the translations. I can only, maybe there was more than one. I can only think of one inaccuracy that we found in the fact sheet content during this project. I agree with you, Kathy, that it's important to do that. Honestly, I don't think that we probably have enough staff time to do a thorough review of, all 400 pages of content on a regular basis like that. When inspectors are using the documents and something doesn't seem right to them, they let me know. Oftentimes it is not an inaccuracy in the content, but rather just it needs a little more clarification. And for that, we generally don't change the English version. We usually just work with the individual inspector, our our FDA standards. We'll work with the inspectors to further clarify the requirements. When we have a new food code adopted, we'll obviously need to, like, that will be the time where we have to go through everything with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that any changes are incorporated.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to read Heather's comment in the chat to clarify her question a bit more. Can a customer call MDA or MDH and ask for a language line translator to converse with MDA or MDH staff? Or is more of a resource, or is this more of a resource for the MDH, MDA employees for internal communication? Sarah, you got that one?
Well, I don't know if Wendy is still on. Maybe she could answer that one. I think I know the answer.
And I think, so I'm jumping in for Alita. I know the answer is yes for us. I mean, I've used it before when over the phone, if there's someone calling in, when I used to do the complaint line and needed to explain their complaint, and I don't remember the language. I think it was Vietnamese, that we were able to use that. And I don't know, Nicole, if you want to add anything for the inspection side of things.
I'll just jump in. This is Wendy. We do have it available, but honestly, I can think of just a few instances where we've needed it. Like I said, most of the time when we need to use the language line, it's when we have to speak to every employee in a restaurant one-on-one, and it's a confidential issue. So those are the instances where we may need to use it, but otherwise we really don't have a lot of issues with our communication.
Okay. Thanks, Wendy. All right, and then everybody check the chat because Annalisa posted the job descriptions for Suzanne and Kathy's, Suzanne Dreesen and Kathy Brandt's positions as they retired. So check that out. If you know anybody, tell them to apply, encourage them to apply. And if not, then I think we go to our next agenda item, which is a cottage food update. If Shelley Erickson is on, if Shelley, you want to take that away, and if Jen is on.
This is Shelley Erickson. Jen is not with us today. She's on her way to Tennessee. Jane asked me to give a quick update on what we discussed at our last quarterly meeting, Cottage Food quarterly meeting. We pretty much went over what Alita just talked about with the translating the cottage food stuff. And we talked with Maureen from the University of Minnesota Extension about some questions that Kathy had about elderberries, and adding some freeze-dried training to the training information on all the websites, because freeze-dried foods have become quite popular recently. We discussed putting together a team, and we're going to review the non-potentially hazardous foods list every year, because we found some discrepancies in it that need to be taken care of. So we're going to be working with Maureen and Alita and Kathy to do that. A question that has come up a lot with the cottage food producers is about employees and how that works. So we talked about that, if a cottage food producer can have employees. We also talked about our upcoming conferences. The farmers market has theirs coming in December, and ours will be January 12th and 13th. we've already lined up some great speakers. Lindsay Kuhn's going to talk about liability and copywriting and things like that. Kathy's going to talk about being a vendor at the farmers markets, and Alita is going to be giving an update on the MDA stuff, and Maureen's got some great information that she's going to be sharing about food safety. We also have our annual cottage food get together on October 30th at the Lions Park in Big Lake from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and everybody's invited, so please come if you can make it. And we briefly talked about the possibility of cottage food producers being able to ship. And I think that's about it. Did I miss anything, Kathy?
No, I think that's okay. Any questions for Shelley? The Minnesota Cottage Food Producers Association pulls everybody together 4 times a year for quarterly meetings to do updates and discuss issues. So we just had that in October, and the next one is coming up, I think, in January.
Yes.
Any questions for Shelley then on cottage foods?
This is Jane. I do have a question about where the conversation went on the possibility of being able to ship product.
We've spoken to somebody from the FDA that says that there's no reason why we shouldn't be allowed to ship our products as long as they're not acidic. So we just have to decide if that's something that is that we just have to take that to one of the things that we'll be doing in the next legislative session.
Any other questions? All right. If not, the next item ties in with cottage food. This is an issue that actually came up on that gorgeous Facebook page, Minnesota Registered Cottage Food Producers, that Shelley and Jen and Karen manage. That is a wonderful group out there. And this one came up, and then we circled it back through the city of Minneapolis and then through MDA. And Jeff, I don't know if you want me to set it up or Alita, or who would like to take the lead on what we ended up with here.
Hey, everybody, Jeff here. Yeah, Kathy, why don't you go ahead, set it up and we can take it away.
So the confusion came in how we were interpreting 28A.152, and Jane could put that link to that law in the chat if we needed it. The way that that law is written, does the law actually say that cottage food products have to be prepackaged at home? So you can't do any kind of packaging. And again, that would mean, defining what that word packaging means. In our discussion, Jeff uses the word dispensing, which he can talk to us when we get to that. So that was helpful. And then if you do bring, bulk, a lot of cottage food items can be bulk, and then you can dispense them at the market. And that's when you put it into the package and make sure that the label is there. But if you do that there, does that require a hand washing station when it's not in 28A.152? It is in the food sampling law, but they're not doing food samples. They're doing, your onesie twosie products and putting it in the packaging at that point. And how do you, knowing all of that, also knowing that it's not in the law requiring a hand washing station, but then how do you make sure it's done in a food safe way to do that? So we discussed all of that, and we'd like to then get some input from you folks on to how to practically get this done at farmers markets and community events. So now I'll hand it off to Jeff and Alita.
All right. Yeah, Kathy, thank you for that. And good, I'll say good afternoon to everybody. Just doing a quick check on time here. So yeah, most definitely. I think a good place to start on this one with respect to food safety, because on this particular issue, you're dealing with licensed exempt entities, those that qualify for the cottage food exemption. But our state law, Minnesota statutes 31, 34A, the state laws on food safety still require that the food be made, that it's safe, wholesome, not adulterated, not misbranded, right? So like Kathy stated, right, in this case, two things involved here. One is, the idea that, the cottage food producers, and I think this has been happening for a long time, and I myself will acknowledge, witnessing this as an inspector years ago, and seeing this and not recognizing it as a problem. That is that a cottage food producer would bring both prepackaged as well as some bulk items, to a market, set up in their stand, meet every requirement for cottage food producer in terms of signage and all of that and registration, but may have, like, on display, covered, safely displayed individual items or pieces of whatever it is they've made, right? A confectionery, bakery, whatever it is. And then sort of, customers come up and then they just sort of dispense items into a package upon, customer order, what have you, right? So that's sort of just to illustrate an example of this idea of, bulk food and working with what would essentially be considered open food and dispensing. And most certainly this is not sampling. And so the sampling part of Minnesota Statutes 28A and the requirements there, that was sort of an exemption from licensing, if you will, for vendors that are sampling food, and all of that is sort of defined in that part. So I think we can recognize and agree that, food sampling, the law and the requirements and that would not apply in this case, like, if food sampling is in fact not occurring, but they're just essentially dispensing and packaging on site some of the foods for per customer order, that kind of thing. But that gets us back then to this idea that the food must be handled safely, and under Minnesota statutes, the food laws, right, around it. And to that end, it is the idea that an individual, an operator working with open food would need to have clean hands and be able to clean their hands is very understandable and necessary. So the idea of that hand washing capability be there is most definitely understandable in that case. But here's where I think, with respect to hand washing, I'll digress just a moment here before carrying on. I think, to illustrate this point, at some farmers markets, other, licensing agencies have gone and have seen, like, say, a licensed exempt stand sort of next to another stand that is not license exempt and has observed sort of similar, like if you think about this in terms of food handling activities, and from just sort of a control, a public health control standpoint, where one stand is required based on those activities under Minnesota rule because they're licensed to have hand washing capability, but the other stand, it's not specified in law except the condition that the food be safe, not adulterated, not contaminated, not misbranded, right? Where the other stand doesn't necessarily have it. And so then, to all parties involved that may not necessarily understand the details of licensing law and where the Minnesota Food Code applies and doesn't apply, that can become a very confusing thing to operators. It can be very confusing even to the regulatory, right, in terms of public health protection. So the confusion, the questioning around this is very understandable. And this is where I would come back and say, hey, look, yeah, I think the idea that, operators in that case that are working with open food and dispensing it would need to have the ability to wash their hands, for sure. But how that happens, I think is where there's some flexibility and some options, sort of, case specific to the market. Like in this case, farmers market involved. You can conceive perhaps of various scenarios where maybe in one case each vendor does sort of the best option. And I guess that's the idea, is sort of thinking about and targeting sort of what the best option is. But and in one case, it could be that, hey, individual stands have hand washing capability, just given the size and the busyness and layout of the market. Perhaps another market might have hand washing stations furnished in some other fashion. Perhaps there's one that could serve more than one stand. Co-located is it, and I'm speaking in reference to basically these license exempt stands, such as cottage food producer stands at farmers markets. So I'll stop there. I'll see if Alita has anything to add, and I'd be very curious to entertain more thoughts, more input from the group on this and perspectives. But really the sort of the rider here, and I think the place to start really is from the idea from food safety law to provide safe food that is not adulterated, contaminated, or misbranded. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
I don't have anything to add to what you've already stated, Jeff, so would just be curious to hear others' thoughts too.
And then Lori's got a question. 28A.152, Lori, is for farmers markets and community events. That's where, and from your home. So it's just, this is all related to just that law. And so to add a little bit more, so where MFMA in our training, we like to stick to the words, if it's in the law, it's a must. If it's not in the law, it's a should, so that we're very clear on what is mandated and what isn't. And then of course that gets awkward when we get into these gray areas. Like we really want to, because to Jeff's point, 31 and 34A versus that very narrow language in 152. So and the other thing that I forgot to set this up. So when we were talking about if it has to come in, if some of these cottage foods have to come in prepackaged, it means that there most likely will be an increase in plastic containers. If you think about sticky cupcakes with that really delicious frosting that's 2 inches high, and that works against then other markets' values, and what they're pushing for is zero plastic. And so that's where, if we can somehow, I of course came up with the brilliant idea, okay, let's just not put a licensed food vendor next to an unlicensed food vendor, so it doesn't look like it's so stark of a difference, but that doesn't really get to the point. Good strategy, but it still, leaves us with how do we help farmers markets, make sure that there's hand washing available. Coming out of COVID, right? During COVID, many farmers markets got that $250 grant from MDA to buy hand washing stations. So maybe hand washing stations are available at markets that we could put in common areas where they could use. Anyone else have any thoughts on this or ideas? You can raise your hand or unmute.
Kathy, the only thing like we discussed the other day, my biggest concern about packaging on site is making sure that the required labels are passed to the consumer.
Good point, Julie. And so I think how we left the discussion last week when we, tried to problem solve this is that, no, they don't have to come in prepackaged. That's not in the law. And yet, once they get to a farmer's market, we're going to have to help everybody have hand washing. Somehow those hands have to be clean. And then to dispense that food cleanly. So MDA will have a little bit of cleanup to do on their website. We'll make sure that we get the wording right. Jane and I are offering 6 monthly trainings of Blazing Trails via Zoom, November through April. And we're meeting with Jody Burke next week, I think. Yeah, next week, to make sure that our 250 some slides are, we're all in agreement on how we're going to push that through. And so we'll do that. Okay,
Yeah.
Amanda, good luck at your market tonight. Go ahead, Jeff.
No, thank you for that. Sorry to interrupt there, Kathy. Thanks for pointing out too, because our website on the FAQs, that part, we do have a little bit of work to do on some of the language we have there. So definitely tracking that internally. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, it is 2:02. Our agenda says that we are going to take a break until 2:05. So you have a 3-minute break to go grab a bite to eat or drink or restroom, and we'll meet you back here at 2:05, okay? 3 minutes. I'll put the timer on. Interesting. Okay, folks, my phone says 2:05 and my computer says 2:06. So I guess we're gonna start. Next up on the agenda is a question about boutiques and when does a store need to have a license if it's not their primary mode of business? So let me talk you through it. What if a boutique consignment store, the holiday season is quickly approaching. There are pop-up boutiques going on everywhere. It's an arts and crafts boutique with some jam, jelly, syrup, flavored honey, roasted nuts. How much food is present in that store before that store would need a retail food handler license? We're not talking cottage food here at all. This is licensed food, because cottage food obviously would not work, right? Because the cottage food producer herself would have to be there. What if a boutique without other food items for sale gets several farmers to come in and display their wares within a retail space, but not a licensed retail food space? Would that qualify as a farmer's market? So this was in the agenda. It looks to me like we're going to be looking at MDA staff. So should we take that first one first? And Jane, if you need to pop on and explain this in better detail than I did, let me know.
I don't know if more detail is needed. If folks want me to provide another example, I went back in my Ask Misa archives from last spring when I had I was kind of peppered with questions from someone who was doing a boutique type of thing and had all of these ideas for, how they could add local food products into their store that was not a food store. It was like a consignment type boutique with clothing and scarves and purses and cutesy notebooks and stuff like that.
Who would MDA would like to take this one?
This is Jody. I could start out. So if a store that is mostly non-food items wants to sell food, they would need a retail food license to sell those packaged food items unless they met some sort of exemption or exclusion. And really the only exclusion would be if they were selling just only packaged candy, soda, or nuts. Otherwise, they would need a retail food handler license to sell the packaged foods.
So Jody, you were saying you're going to use those words specific in the language in that, is it an exclusion or exemption? That's in 28A.15 something, right?
Correct.
So only if those items listed in that subpart, otherwise they would need one. That helps. I mean, that actually helps us. Okay. And so,
I don't know.
Okay, well, all right. So then what about I'm going to share my screen and show the email that I got from this person because they had a bunch of ideas. And this is a little bit run on and wordy and disjointed, and I'm sure inspectors will recognize the format. Okay, so I'm wondering if a shop was to do a self-service farmer's market with a collection at each of the vendors, would we be able to proceed? So, her first step with the shop was locally made gifts and items. So what she's thinking about here is kind of setting up a farmer's market with vendors in her store, which is not a licensed food store. We've had a food innovation team case about a situation with someone who had a licensed retail food space and wanted to bring her own cottage food into that space. And that was a no, because even though she was the owner of the shop and the cottage food producer, having her own cottage food in the retail space would still cross the line and not be allowed. But in a situation where it's a retail store space, but not a food store space, would that be a situation where someone could bring in like 3 farmers on a Saturday to have their own little farmers market inside that store?
So I think, well, first and foremost, would it meet the definition of a farmer's market? Which, like you just said, 3 or more people that gather together to sell their product of the farm. And then in that case, since it's a farmer's market, it would open it up for potentially cottage food operators.
Yeah.
I don't know about right within the retail area, but I know of other buildings that have asked to use other parts of the building, like a brewery, not necessarily in the brewery service area, but in another area. I don't know if anybody else from retail or anything would like to expand on that.
Yeah, hey, you know what? This is one of those things I just want to bring up for consideration. And I think, within these spaces, now I'm not an expert here. I just want to bring it up. And this is maybe something that would just need to be researched further. But these buildings have sort of, as they're zoned, they have their permitted and accessory uses and stuff like that locally under local ordinance. And then they have their occupancy. Things like that. Now, while it would meet, it has the potential to meet the definition of farmers market in that space, I think you'd really have to check in with the local unit of government to make sure that the use of that space within the facility is okay from everything within a local unit of government, and how properties are zoned for land use with respect to their permitted and accessory uses and things of that nature. And there isn't any issue with the occupancy and all of that kind of stuff. Local officials is what I would suggest on there. This is Jeff. There's also subdivision 5 in this part of the statutes about farmers markets and that definition. I just want to make sure everybody's aware, because there's, subdivision 6 that speaks about a definition exception. And it says specifically in this part of the law that the definition of farmers market does not prohibit a farmers market association from establishing a definition of farmers market that applies to its members that is more restrictive than the definition that is, otherwise we had referred to. So I'll pause there and just see if there's other input, thoughts, considerations. Thanks.
I did put into the chat the exemption that Jody had referenced early on that conversation. And Jeff, to your point, that specific language about an association being able to define farmers market in a different way, when we put that law into place, that was specifically to help out the city of Minneapolis, who had already defined like 5 or 6 different categories. And, in order to get the safe food sampling exemption in place, we had to define what a farmer's market was, because the exemption applied to that. So we put that in there specific to that section.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Kathy.
And that made it work for everybody. So Jody, that's where you write that subdivision 7, that you're saying that was for the first example, that ice, soft drinks, and snacks, they have to meet just that in order to have that exemption for their store, correct?
Correct.
Okay. That helps.
Okay, so this is Jane. So what I'm hearing is that that having that kind of activity within a non-food retail space could qualify as a farmer's market. But there could be local ordinances and zoning that would still restrict it. But then again, there might not. Correct?
Yeah, that would be my understanding. I think it'd be very much worthwhile to make sure, locally that how that space is being used is permitted that way.
Okay, and so then there could potentially be cottage food vendors in that kind of space participating in the farmer's market, as long as there were enough actual farmers there to make it meet the definition of a farmer's market. As long as the store itself was not carrying food items and was truly like a craft and artsy gift type of store, not a food store.
Yeah, that's correct. And I just will add that this is a question that I know we've been getting. I know Jody got this exact question about what defines a farmer's market. And at that point, when can we start to have cottage food people come in? So I think that's a good distinction.
Shelley's got a question in the chat. So one would have to work with whoever owned the place to make sure zoning requirements, occupancy, et cetera, requirements were met. Also, the facility would want to check out liability. True. What about a coffee house? Shelley, are you thinking, could a coffee house bring in a farmer's market? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, or like, yes, exactly, because we have a new coffee shop that's very community oriented.
Mhm.
And like during the holidays, it would be pretty cool to be able to have some kind of an event like that during the holidays.
Jody, to your point, let's say that it was a place of a food business, like a coffee house.
They
And
really
they-
only serve coffee. They have a few pastries that they bring in, but there's not a lot of food. It's mostly ice cream and coffee.
Sounds like a great place. So let's say they let a farmer's market come in, and then part of the farmer's market are cottage food producers. Is there a line there where they would have to set up so you would not have cottage food in the place where the food is made? Is that what we're getting at here?
Well, they don't make food there. They just sell, it comes pre-made
Okay.
from a different retail area.
But they're making beverages on site there. Yeah.
Yes, they're making coffee, correct? Right, Shelley? They're making
Yes.
coffee? Yeah.
Yes.
And they're
that is
brewing coffee and selling cups of coffee. So then what, Jody?
Well, and hang on, and they're serving ice cream, right? Because you mentioned ice cream. I would assume that they're not selling it in little prepackaged cups, but they're dispensing it from a
That's
tub.
correct. That's correct.
Yeah.
So I may defer this to MDH since those establishments are licensed by MDH. Those types.
That's right. Way to hand that one off to H. Anybody on from health that wants to answer that one? And if we need time to research this, that's okay, because we are going to need the answer when we hit Blazing Trails, and our first Blazing Trails is scheduled for November. So we can follow up with somebody on health side if we need to. That might be Angie, I'm guessing.
This is Wendy. I was just
Oh,
gonna
Wendy,
jump in here.
thank
We might want to research this a little bit because, you know, we have a lot of different types of like event centers. Our retail license is broad in that we license everything from, you know, food service for schools, restaurants, American Legions, event centers. So we have a lot of different types of activities that go on in event centers, and that isn't like, for instance, we could have a Legion club that would have their dance hall rented out for some kind of a vendor fair or something. We wouldn't know if they were serving food there or whatever. That's, you know, not necessarily part of the Legion business. So I think we'd have to know more details about how each specific situation, how they're going to operate it. So I think we'd want to do a little bit more research on this. I'm not aware of this question coming up to us. Angie, are you aware of? Are you still on?
Yeah, I haven't heard this question. And I don't know if Matt has gotten it either.
And team again, Jeff here, if I might, I just think too, you know, it goes a little bit beyond, in my mind, that the licensing part of this here, and that is, you know, what the facility was built for in its use, and the local unit of government, and whether or not they are okay with how that space is used, whether it's permitted accessory, kind of doing those, holding those kind of functions there. Because I can recall working at local unit of governments where, you know, the idea that, let's say, an outdoor market, you know, holding one in like a parking lot of a business, you know, within the jurisdiction, right? So those are things that would come before the city for to be able to make sure everything's okay to do that kind of stuff. So I really think, you know, the idea of trying to use a particular space for an entirely different reason, it would be a really good idea to get in with the local unit of government to make sure from an occupancy, land use, you know, stuff like that, zoning, that those kinds of things are okay with them. I think it goes a little bit, yeah, transcends this issue of licensing to the extent that, hey, it's outside of the area where we would do, you know, food handling, food inspection, you know, food safety concerns. I don't think anybody's talking about going back into the kitchen to hold anything, but sort of, you know, in the customer area, it would be my take on this. And whether it's within the MDH or MDA type facilities, I think that really got to kind of come to terms and understand how that you know, the principal use of that space that way, and that I think the local unit of government come in to play. I think all of that should be considered. Building officials, you know, et cetera. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. We'll add that. That's a nice checklist. Might be a good starting point for folks. Okay, any last thoughts on this? Otherwise, we are going to move on to dogs at farmers markets. Okay, we'll move on to dogs at farmers markets. So this is a hard conversation with our farmers markets. But I can talk you through the history that I know. There could be a different history. Ben Miller and Stephen Diaz made a determination several years ago that dogs could be allowed at farmers markets as long as they stayed outside of the vendors' food booths. And we can copy Jane, that link to that no animals and food establishments. That's 4626.1585. That's where that talks about that. And so the determination there was the pathway, so pragmatically speaking, at a farmer's market, the pathways between food booths is not a food establishment. So, you know, dogs could walk there, but a dog cannot come into a food booth, a booth that's selling food, whether it's produce or whatever. But they can be in the aisles. Well, and that applies because farmers markets are not licensed entities. Some are, however, if they are a farmer's market food hub, that farmer's market itself, that food hub has a license, so that wouldn't apply to those, 9 to 12 farmers markets. So the problems that arise is that these dogs, they can pee on things. Many of them are tall enough they can lick the tables before that person gets them back under control. Small dogs are being carried, and then they put paws on tables. And then, of course, many farmers markets, aren't on tar. So they've got gravel and dirt. And if the dog pees or poops there, then we've got that problem. So as far as the farmers market MFMA is concerned, there's food safety issues. And Annalisa sent me 7 texts on this today, like, no dogs at farmers markets. It's too much poop. And from MFMA's point of view, the food safety is one thing, but oh my goodness, those dog bites, when those dogs get into fights, those are going to be hard accidents for our liability insurance. So, but since the insurance part, the bite part doesn't really come into LFAC, should we talk about, is there another way does this law need to be revised? Like no dogs, but there are many, as Minneapolis is allowing dogs in like beer joints, right? Anybody got any ideas on this? Jane, you unmuted, you want to talk?
Yeah, I just want to add on to that a little bit that Kathy and I and Lori Cox had a kind of long and snarky discussion with each other about whether it would be covered by existing law or not. The issue is that most farmers markets are not licensed. A few are, but most are not, and therefore not considered a food establishment and therefore not subject to the food code. So, banning dogs from farmers markets falls into one of these things that's really, really a good idea, but can we get there within existing law? Or can we not quite get there within existing law and have to change the law? And one of the things I pointed out was that, okay, if you've got licensed entities at the farmers market, because there are some vendors who are licensed, if the farmers market itself is not, but there are vendors who are, then what is the legal obligation of the farmers market to provide a venue where the licensed vendors can comply with the law? Because if dogs are allowed in the common space and the boundary between that common space and the vendor's booth is really fuzzy, which it is because vendors put out product on tables and like drawing a hard line, the dog can have its feet standing in the common space and its nose on the table. So that's a fuzzy boundary. So how can we deal with that?
And I thought it was a good discussion and I appreciated it. So I hope Jane and Kathy, I hope all three of us appreciated it.
Oh yeah, we did. We argued with each other.
I know, and I loved it. And it brought it to the fore. I think that's the point. And, when I took food safety with Annalisa and her team, the point is also that farms are also not licensed entities. However, we also have to remember about removing risk. And that was the point of her showing us really interesting pictures way back when about what kinds of domesticated animals were crawling all over everything without even a thought from the farmer. And so as food safety has moved forward, and also as we have all moved forward and understand how do you remove risk from a food establishment, whether that be licensed, whether that be the farm, whether that be the source, whether that be a retail location, that's what I learned was, even though I wasn't FSMA on my farm, I did everything that I should to remove risk. And that's where I think, my point of the conversation came in of, I absolutely appreciate what is and isn't licensed, but I take it all the way back to the source of farm. And we still had to learn and understand those domestic animals, because they propose risk, should actually be removed from this type of situation. So therefore, when the farmers market came up, I thought it was a good discussion, but I would love to hear from others as well.
Angie's got a good question, chat. Do farmers markets have insurance? Would the possibility of dog bites or fights happening be something the insurance company would not allow? Yeah, many of the 352, 57 farmers markets that we know about, many of them do carry insurance, but there's a substantial ones that do not. Many of the farmers markets that carry our insurance are located on city or county property, like in parks, and dogs are allowed in those parks. And the city, so the ones that I know about, the city overrules the farmers markets. And so those dogs are allowed in the park, and the farmers market is in the park. Therefore, the dogs are allowed in the park. And, so maybe we go back to the discussion that happened, back in that meeting with Ben Miller and Stephen. Does that still hold? Or would we still agree that, do we still agree that the area between the stalls is not? I know that if I brought this to a vote at the Minnesota Farmers Market Association, that I don't know if we could get it passed. There are so many farmers markets that brag about allowing dogs. Bring your dog to the market. That if it went to a vote, I'm not sure it would be a majority vote. Brett Olson's got a good point in there. Do we have any documentation of anyone becoming sick because of a dog at a farmer's market? In the state of Minnesota, as far as I know, we have never yet had a foodborne illness reported to a farmer's market.
This is Wendy, and I think you're correct, Kathy. I don't think that we've ever had an illness attributed to a dog at a farmer's market. Couldn't this be something that's handled by the managers themselves? If that's, do we see a large number of dogs being a problem? Or I guess the farmers markets I've been at, when I've seen dogs, I haven't really seen any problems. I can see where people are attracted to the idea of bringing their dogs. It's kind of a social thing. And
Wendy, you're in my camp. I took that position in the argument with Jane and Lori. I think this is actually an issue that market managers can resolve by mandating. I don't know. Yeah, so that's the question. Do we need to change the law? Because market managers could handle this right now. If they wanted to say no dogs in this market, they could do it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And if you change the food code right now, these, the farmer's market is exempt from the food code.
Right.
It's the individual vendors. So changing the food code wouldn't help.
We did that I was at Lakes and Legends, the brewing company, and they allow dogs in that area. And 2 dogs got in. This one dog, that owner was incredibly irresponsible, and that dog got into multiple fights while we were there. And nobody blinked. It was like, okay.
And I think the conversation that came at the time where I was just at the St. Paul Farmers Market, right in front of the baseball field, and they have a sign stating no dogs, which I appreciated just because of what I learned, and that's what I look for when I go for a market. But I would agree with everyone here of, is it an individual level?
This is Heather, and all I can think about is a lot of our events up here are at city parks or community centers, and they all say no dogs, no dogs, no dogs.
Oh.
And people walk right by that sign with their dog in their little backpack or on their wagon or whatever. And I think about like Blueberry Fest in Ely is like one of the biggest festivals, and it's at the park, and there's signs all over, no dogs. And you get to see all sorts of dogs in that park. And people will approach, the folks that have the dogs sometimes they won't. Sometimes vendors will say stuff. Our events, we only have 3 days of summer up here. So we have a lot of events that are in hot summer days. So sometimes you get the pushback of it's too hot in my car. I'm traveling. I'm on vacation here. So I do see a lot of no dog signs and a lot of people completely just ignoring them. So that's got to put folks in a tough situation too, where you can post all you want, but if people don't respect the guidelines, that's hard too.
Jane's got her hand up.
Yeah, so I wanted to address the issue that Matt Finkenbeiner put in the chat, and it says the issue is that cottage food and farmers market vendors want to bring their dogs to keep them company while they vend. I don't see dogs brought by the patrons as a food safety issue. I want to push back on that because I've been a farmers market vendor in Grand Rapids for a lot of years, and I've personally witnessed someone carrying a little dog whose paw was dragging across the open little pint boxes of raspberries on a vendor's table. You know, that looks to me like a food safety issue. We've seen people come carrying their pets, like they're carrying, at the market, I have seen people carrying dogs, cats, rabbits, and iguanas. And, you know, they're holding those pets and then they reach out and pinch the tomatoes or pick up the carrots and handle them. You know, that handling of food products happens all the time by customers. And if they're carrying their animal, then, you know, they've got cat or dog or rabbit hair or iguana scales on their hands. I do think it is a food safety issue of patrons bringing pets into the market.
I've actually never seen a vendor bring, but it's hard enough to manage your stand without having a dog there. But they could, and might be at other markets. Any other thoughts on dogs? I mean, we'll bring it up at our annual conference is December 7th and 8th, and we can have a good discussion at our conference on how we want to handle this and talk about not only the biting issues and that liability I personally do not want to claim on coming through our policies, but and also the food safety and see where we could take that. Any last thoughts on dogs?
Well, the reason why to look at whether there is a prohibition on it that we could find in law is to just give market managers a little more underpinning to ban them. You know, you could put up a sign banning dogs and then you get aggressive patrons who are like, what gives you the right to ban my dog? And if you can point to the law saying that, you know, then that gives you some underpinning to maintain the food safety that you know is important at the market. And also helps with vendor acceptance of that kind of restriction.
Yeah, Jeff, here I'll just add though, one point to consider is that perhaps maybe not all markets want to prohibit dogs. And so legislatively, I don't know, I bring that up for consideration that the other part of that is, the process of introducing a bill and whether it's accepted and the public input on a topic like that. I don't know that would easily get through. So perhaps markets, I do get the idea that it can be tough, right? Being the ones that have to make a decision prohibiting animals or not, but perhaps best overall that given the flexibility and the options market by market is there. But to your point, Jane, I definitely understand, right? The idea that customers, there is that, whether or not they actually abide by city signs, posting animals prohibited or pets prohibited, that's a whole nother matter. So definitely understandable.
And this is Jamie with the Minnesota Grocers Association. And Jeff, I would mirror that legislatively, it gets a little complicated. We spent a lot of time working on service animals in stores and people bringing pets in stores and misrepresenting, and it does get, there's a lot of layers and complexities. So just know that that, and we do have service animal statute that I don't know if that would translate or not either, but just would agree that there's a lot of complexities and a lot of stakeholders when you start getting into that.
I agree, Jamie. There was a blow up on Facebook exchanges. Someone asked another patron if their dog was a service dog, and that caused a lot of angst. So in my opinion, MFMA will approach it from, we'll try to educate and influence, because I do not believe that if someone proposed a law that MFMA, the board would go along with it, just because there's too many farmers markets that love their dogs. Great discussion, everyone. Thank you so much. Kate and Alex and Val, do you want to rescue us from the dog conversation? Kate, I can see you laughing at us.
We can sure try and shift gears here, but that was an interesting conversation. And actually, I think Val's going to get us started, so I'll let Val go first.
Either
Hey,
way,
Val.
honestly.
Good to see you, Val.
Good to see you too. I have nothing to say on dogs at this point. For the local food purchase assistance program, we are really, really, really close to having a draft application available. So please look for that within the next couple weeks, 2 weeks at the most, I'm thinking at this point. We'll be looking for input, feedback on that application. It will be available online and through other means if requested. So once we have that application finalized, then we will turn around and open that request for projects, which is really exciting. So getting pretty close on that one. That's about it for LFPA at this point. So I can pass to Kate because I think there's more happening on the other side right now.
Yeah, so and then as a reminder, in addition to the LFPA, the Local Food Purchasing Assistance Funds that MDA received, we also received $3.5 million for the LFS, Local Food for Schools program. And that $3.5 million is being used for our existing farm to school reimbursement grants for schools. And those applications are actually now live. And I can throw the link in the chat here in a second. But those grants are for any K-12 school across the state that participates in the National School Lunch Program. And there's two main food reimbursement grants. So a school can apply for the First Bite grant, which is designed for schools that are maybe new to farm to school or wanting to start small in their local purchasing, and they can apply for up to $10,000, no match requirement. And, and they can use that funding to purchase unprocessed and minimally processed foods grown or raised in the state of Minnesota. And then for schools that are a little bigger, have some experience with farm to school, or just ready to really jump in wholeheartedly, there's the Full Tray Grant. And that grant is, the awards for that are based on a formula that looks at how many meals the school served last October. And then with a reimbursement rate of 20 cents a meal for 10 months. And so there's a formula that schools use to calculate how much they're eligible to request, but that's up to $100,000, also no match. So thanks to the LFS funding this year, both grant options for schools have no match requirement. And we were able to increase the awards for both of those grants. In addition to that, there is an equipment grant that schools can apply for if they also apply for a food reimbursement grant. And that the equipment grant is being funded through the state Agri Farm to School dollars that we have. So we have about $750,000 for equipment grants, and that's a 1-to-1 match. And it's for equipment that will help schools purchase, prepare, and serve more local foods. So we're really excited. We have about 4 times the funding as we normally do. And so we're really hopeful that we'll get some new schools applying for grants this year, and also seeing schools that have applied in the past who are looking to expand their farm to school purchasing, perhaps into new items or in larger amounts. So please help us spread the word. As I mentioned, grant applications are due November 17th. There is an informational webinar coming up, I believe on November 2nd. I'll put the link to that in the chat as well. And that webinar will give schools a lot of information on what the application process is, what's eligible, what's not for foods. But we would appreciate help getting the word out, and hopefully we'll get some great applications this year. And I'm seeing some questions in the chat. So in regards to Emily's question around like TA related to school readiness, these grants are just for food purchases. So that's actually a requirement of the federal funding that we received for this grant. So it will just reimburse schools for their purchases that they make. We wish that we could have funds that could also go to TA and outreach, but we as a farm to school leadership team are thinking about how we can provide more training and support to our grantees through this grant period, just using our existing team capacity, so to speak, for this time being. But yeah, the funds are just for food purchases. And then to Lori's question, so for the full trade grant, which is the larger of the two grants, schools do have to provide at least one letter of support from a farm that they plan to work with. And on both grant applications, they have to respond to a question on how they've connected with farms or are, doing ongoing outreach to farms. They don't have to necessarily have every single farm identified for their funding. But they do have to have some farmers identified or a plan for how they'll be doing that outreach and building those relationships. So some farms may be getting requests for letters of support from the full trade applicants. The first bite applicants don't need to provide any letters of support. And we are working with several on the call to think about how we, including Jane and Annalisa and Running the Countryside, to potentially do some farm to school, like buyer farmer matchmaking sessions in connection with upcoming GAPS trainings this year, so that we can help facilitate some of those conversations and hopefully start to see new relationships built between farms and schools. And I think that's all I had to share, but happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Thank you, Val and Kate. Any more questions? I know the question that I was worried about this morning before my entire Zoom and internet went off into the wild, wild west. I'm a little concerned about when the money runs out in year two, to have farmers try to ramp up to meet this. And then, so I'm guessing that's a policy thing we'll have to pursue via the legislature. Are you right?
Right. Yes. For LFS, it's schools have 1 year to spend these funds, and after that funding, we will go back to the state funds that we have, which is about $750,000 in grants. So I think one thing we're thinking about is how do we also help schools, and our grantees, with trainings on how to build farm to school into your budget. And, for example, balancing local purchasing with commodity entitlement and, some of that support to help, in recognizing that this is a one-time additional amount of funding. But hopefully we get those relationships made and we can see those relationships carried forward. But we do recognize that this is a challenge of this one-time amount of funding.
Kate, is it legal to take the money now and spend it in 2 or 3 years, or is that against that?
No, we have to. Yeah, we have to spend it within basically by February of 2024. And so as schools are submitting invoices to MDA, we're submitting that proof back to the USDA. So it is a really short timeline. LFPA's timeline is a little longer. LFS is quite short.
I guess just to add on to that really quickly, the LFPA timeline actually was potentially extended by another year recently. We're still waiting for more details from the USDA on that, but we may be able to push that out to the fall of 2025 now with a new application for additional funds to support that work. So.
Val, will you do outreach on that? Or are you going to do a webinar, or how do you want to do that once you've got your plan locked in more?
We're planning. So with the draft application, we're actually planning to do some listening sessions just to provide people that format for providing feedback rather than submitting through an online form. Once that's finalized and it's open, still working out the complete timeline, but I definitely will be doing engagement activities around that grant. Because it's similar to LFS, like we need to determine what's going to help connect farms and distributors and then underserved communities throughout the state. So
Yeah. Okay. Emily has a great point. I think we should pursue this. Where does that thought is, Emily? Would it be possible to create something like an endowment to have some kind of large investment and then use interest? Val, you're shaking your head yes. What does that mean?
I love that thought. I'm shaking my head because that makes sense. Where that would come from, I'm not sure. Or where it would live, I'm not sure, but I like the idea.
No, I'm just saying, like, we need to have creative methods and finance mechanisms, right? Instead of relying on the same systems that we always do. And I always try to think about how can we borrow different structures that work for other people and other industries or business models, and then how can we retool that and like make it work for us? And this has been a thought that's been on my mind for a while, is like, how can you make those strategic one-time investments that just keep paying dividends? And like, why don't we do that in this space? I'm sure there's lots of legalities around that. And maybe it hasn't been done before, but just something to consider.
Okay, Emily's on that short list of committee members. Take a look at those outside the box thinking things. It's a good idea. All right, folks, it is, my computer says 2:53. Which means we have 7 minutes left to adjourn this meeting. Any final thoughts on the grants coming in for Kate or for Val? If not, remember that our next Jane, you unmuted. You need to hop in.
Yeah, actually, Kathy, I don't remember if you mentioned at the start that Cassie Dahl was going to be on today to talk about grants coming up for organic agriculture, and she was ill and not able to attend. So there are some grants coming up regarding organic ag. Does anyone else from MDA have any information about those quickly?
I do not have a lot of the details, but I can certainly try to find out some and send it out to the group afterwards, or connect with Cassie when she's back. I don't know if anyone else from MDA has more details though.
Okay.
You can send them out in both in the minutes and in an email, right?
Yeah, we'll get them out. And then the other thing I wanted to mention quickly is that we do have a LFAC steering committee that takes a look at the draft agenda and, you know, kind of helps guide agenda development. And we've had a couple of people drop off that. Both Wayne Martin and Ren Olive have left the University of Minnesota within the past few months, and they were on the steering committee. So, you know, we're not that short of people on it, but if there's anybody who would like to raise their hand to join that steering committee, we could take on a couple more, kind of a small group to have a little higher level of responsibility for helping develop the agenda topics. And that's all I have, Kathy.
Thanks, Jane. Oh, thanks, Kate, for putting the organic certification cost share program there. Click on those. Applications are due November 1, so 3 weeks. Our next LFAC meeting is January 23. Make sure you got it on your calendar. We do know we've got 2 items that we'll discuss then. The community event definition, we will revisit that. And MFMA is proposing that we revise the food sampling law. There's some, we've lived with that law for 8 years now. There are things in there that we could definitely change for the better. So we'll put together some language and get that to MDA and MDH to kind of take a look at. A couple of things we'd like to, it's tied to that. In the law, we referenced 4626.1855. There were problems with 1855, and now the food code changed, but that language is stuck out there as orphan language because we did it. So we put it in the law that way. So we'll try to change that, and we'll try to, if we can get MDA and MDH's guidance on that, we'll try to change that this year. Jane, it's really not the 23rd. You got it. What did I say? Oh, it is. It's January. Got it.
It's January 23 in that the year is 2023, but the date is January 10th of 2023.
Perfect. There we go. All right. Any last thoughts in the last 3 minutes, folks? Otherwise, thank you for hanging in there and giving us your attention and guidance. Otherwise, we'll see you next year.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. I'll get the meeting notes out. They are actually typed rough, and so if anybody wants to look at them, I'll throw that in the chat really quick, but we'll send it out.
And for those of us in southern Minnesota, it looks like we might get some rain tonight and hopefully not bad weather.